hang around.
Amazing. Okay. What a well-schooled audience. Look at that. Sits down immediately, quiet. Lovely. Ladies and gentlemen, a huge and very, very warm welcome on behalf of the Institute of Cancer Policy and London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine to our little soiree, Cancer Care Sans Frontières. Really marvellous to have you all here. I know I had to inject a little French in, whereas Bernard is here. Really, really delighted to have you here today. Before I go through the running order, first of all, maybe I'll just give you a few words of thanks. Particularly Professor Bill Edwards, who you're going to hear from in a moment, for hosting us here in what is, I think you'll agree, an absolute marvel. It is one of the great jewels, I would say, of medical schools and universities in the world, the Gordon Museum. I'll say no more about it, because Bill's going to illuminate us in a moment about the whole history. Also, very warm thanks to Mark Lodge and Susie Stanway as well. Amazing London Global Cancer Week. What is it, 39 events? Yeah. At least. So this is at least. So it's absolutely fantastic. We've got a ram-packed agenda for the week, and it's great that you're all joining us for our first kick-off. I'm sure the after event has got nothing to do with you all being here. I'd just like to say that Bill's asked me to say, if any of you feel like donating anything, particularly your body parts, see us afterwards, and we can arrange that, obviously being in the Anatomy Museum. And so to business, really. Bill's going to give us a little short discussion on the topic of the museum, and then I'll run you down the agenda. But we've got a really stellar cast today of speakers. We're going to follow it up with a panel, and then really just a Q&A session for the next hour and a half. But thank you so much for being with us today. As I said, I'll hand over to Bill now to talk us through the Gordon Museum. Bill, the floor is yours.
I'm delighted that we could host the event again. I think we did last year, and I think it was a very successful time. What you do is very important, and I'm very, very pleased to be able to support such efforts as yours. So you can relax. I'm the 10-minute warm-up act just to get you comfortable before the real work starts. And again, they've asked me to talk about the museum. So welcome to the Gordon Museum. So this is the largest teaching medical museum in the UK. This is the new building. This opened in 1905. The previous museum at Guy's was started by our museum dad, Thomas Hodgkin. There he is. His first systematic pathology museum was the other side of the green, and that was opened in 1826. So that's first point. Often people describe the Gordon Museum as an anatomy museum. We have a big anatomy department. Our undergraduates, postgraduates still do full dissection. But please don't tell anyone I said so, but anatomy, normal is a bit boring, isn't it really? We're a pathology museum, so we're interested in disease processes. And as you've heard, as I greet you all, have a good look as you come in. You're an incredibly healthy group. It's quite disappointing, really. You can't win them all. Today, 32 weeks ago today, was when I collected the latest specimen from the recovery room. The patient very proudly handed it to me. So there's a point there. We add specimens to the living as well as the dead. The oldest specimen at the moment is circa 1608. So the collections outlived the buildings by quite a lot. So Hodgkin came along in 1826 to make a systematic collection. Before that, they were quite random. And I'm sure you know our main hospital is Guy's St Thomas. Guy's is the new hospital that opened in 1725, and that sprang from St Thomas's, which used to be right next door, which was approximately 1190. So our medical history goes back quite a long way. So Hodgkin put everything together in a systematic way. He wanted to teach pathology to medical professionals, which is exactly what we still do today. So I have a few other hats. I do something with medical art, something with medical history. I do a little bit of cold case forensic work, but essentially my life is about medical education for medical professionals. Now, normally I bore people for the next hour and a half about that. I've got now 9 minutes, so it's going to be quick, okay? So there's Hodgkin. It's always been, the museums here have always been working spaces. That's what we do. If we don't teach, what's the point? Not all museums are so kindly looked after. So, as again, I think you know, the medical school here is a merger of 3 GKT medical school, Guy's, King's and St Thomas's. That is the St Thomas's Museum, which was quite a good museum. I've got the catalogues of it. And that was demolished in the 1960s with the specimens still on the shelves. So I personally would call that an act of vandalism. Incredible, but that's how it was for a long time. And in fact, before COVID, it stopped for a bit. Before COVID, I spent 2 or 3 weeks away in different medical museums across Europe trying to help restart them. So there is a resurgence of medical museums, but not in Britain, actually, funny enough. It's us at the moment. So we intend to be useful, we intend to be comfortable. You know, you've got to be a place to work, but it's got to be comfortable, but you know, we've got to be active. Otherwise, what is the point? So we're an educative collection. So the specimens are mostly organised by organ system, cardiovascular, respiratory, endocrine, neurology, whatever. But there are topic-based areas. So there's an HIV/AIDS collection, there's a forensic collection, there's a fetal abnormality, skin, mouth, whatever. All the specimens have labels on. There's things online, which I'll mention in a minute, but every sheet, or 2 or 3 or 10, depends, will give you a diagnosis. It'll talk you through the pathology, the histology, if it's relevant, pictures of the patient, etc. We're here to teach. That includes forensic medicine. So we have a big forensic collection up there. Anyone have either heard of someone called Professor Simpson, the acid bath murder? So he started our forensic collection. It's something we still use, sadly, fairly regularly for teaching. We used to teach police forces, amongst other things. Technology. It interests me how often people seem to think there's old specimens and new specimens, and you can only apply new technology to new specimens. Well, that's nonsense, isn't it? So there's a lady who managed to have a kyphosis and a scoliosis at the same time, which, believe me, takes some doing. So, we've got decent images, MRI, CT, X-rays of those specimens. We go to a lot of trouble. It isn't quite as random as it seems, so we'll mount things, display them, dissect them, etc., to make them as realistic, as they were in the patient. So, a salivary gland on its own means nothing but sewn on a plate, so you can anatomically place it, makes a big difference. I remember this one from the 70s. This came over from a living patient, still warm, literally, in 1982, I think it was, and it was a lady who had some very impressive gallstones and the gallbladder removed, so we cannulated it. We tinkered with it and made it as near as damn it as look as same as it was with the patient, and then cut it in half so you can see the stones there. Same with hearts, making them transparent, epididymis filled with mercury, prosthetic devices. There's all sorts of things you can do to make things as realistic as possible. The more realistic they are, the more useful they are for teaching. We also embrace our past. So someone's just asking me, so the wax models next door. So we have about 600 from the 19th century. A man called Joseph Town. So that's anatomical, dermatology, comparative anatomy, pathology models. We still use some of them for teaching today, particularly the dermatology models. We have we inherited during COVID, I'll show you a picture of it, about 230 from the 20th century, and we have an artist resident making brand new ones. So we still use old techniques to teach new medicine. Next door, if you get a chance, there's the very first stethoscope ever in the UK. Hodgkin brought that over from Paris. There's the first X-ray machine, guys. Fantastic bit of kit. Fantastic bit of kit. Get really good X-rays. A small point hardly worth mentioning is no shielding. So you radiate the patient, the operator, and everyone in a sort of 8-foot field. The good old days. At this point, I'll usually say all Barts, but just in case, there's only one from Barts. I didn't mean that. I'll take it back. We remember, we mustn't dwell in the past, but we need to remember the people who come before us, just like they will remember you in 100 years' time. Hodgkin, Bright, Addison, Cooper, we have all their specimens of ephemera around the place. It's important to remember these people. They got us where we are today. Perfect solution for me is students, medics, dentists, undergraduate, postgraduate, surgeons, nurses, physios, you name it, whatever sort of medical professional. Students with specimens, with computers, with books and models, all together. If we're not busy, there's no point. So, we picked today because it's a nice quiet day, and obviously we're very keen for you to have good access to the place. So, we'll have big events, small events on the galleries, undergraduate, postgraduate, I don't care. Sometimes postgraduate. Any surgeons who've heard of Professor Harold Ellis? Retired at night, very lazy man, retired at 95. With COVID hit, he's 97 now, he's bored to death, but he carried on teaching until the end. There's Harold, brilliant anatomist. We host exams, the dreaded vivas on occasion. We're a working space. We need to be doing things. Lots of postgraduate stuff, some surgical things lately, spinal inserts. Early in the year, there's a new prosthetic device for paediatric elbows. That's something that people come and practice in here. Because we're adjacent to a dissecting room, you can actually move between the two. So that works very well for us. We're a working space. So museum isn't quite the right word, but I can't think of a better word for it. Big events like this, posters. We even host something called a paediatric teddy bear conference. So these are students going and young F1s going into paediatrics. A really good way to talk to young patients is by operating on their teddy first, their bunny. So we have a Saturday every now and again when the museum is full of sick teddies, bunnies, rabbits, and it's a bit surreal, but they all go home alive, so it works very well. 2017, we felt, because of all the wax models, and again, I've some sort of worked with that. We had this first international congress on wax since 1975. So we have an artist in residence, we have an art historian in residence, we have a writer in residence. So legally, because we had specimens, as you know, we're not open to the public, but we try and push those boundaries as much as we can. I think we have quite a lot to offer. last year we had the world's first virtual reality arthroscopy simulator in this room. We had to clear the room. It was slightly surreal because you had all these people operating on different patients. It was very clever. No one walked into each other quite, but they wandered about. Very successful. So again, we'll embrace the modern as well as the old. If we can use it for teaching, we will. So projects. So it's in teaching, we've got to acquire, we've got to get technology. In outreach, we have artists, etc. We have to try and push in as many places as we can. So just during COVID and just after, I'm building up a normal bone handling collection. That's really for the physios and the trainee surgeons. So that's been quite useful. We need to add specimens, old and new. So this is a classic example of an avulsed and degloved finger. It happens to be 250 years old. So we rescued that from an old Royal Naval Hospital that Haslow used to have some work with. And there's one of the new HIV/AIDS brains. So, there's a spread all the time. We're looking where we can take things. Sometimes the old things can tell you interesting things. So this is from the Royal College of Obstetrics and Gynecology, which closed down recently and moved to nearby. They gave up their museum. So these are classic examples. There's 5 of these pelvi with rickets. And, the classic, as I'm sure you'll know about, how it collapses down and the pelvis collapses in, which is quite interesting. But if you then consider these 5 ladies were pregnant, so a whole new area of teaching to come out. And there's again, about an idea rickets is on the increase again. This one's remarkable. I'd read about these for many years, but I never managed to get one until recently. Again, this is probably 200 plus years old. This is a classic example of a woman of some sort of place in society has been corseted from it as a young girl. So those marks are where her liver has grown into her ribs. Clearly, it's not a problem I have, but it's social history as well as medical pathology. And again, I'm sure believe it or not, corseting is back on the agenda. There's some people in America who started to remove floating ribs from ladies, and then if they want to have a 12-inch waist. I think I was 7 when I had a 12-inch waist last, but anyway. So really what I'm trying to say, there's no such thing as an old disease. Things come back. And this is a really good example. So in the forensic collection, we have one of these so-called fuzzy jaws. So these were from the days, I'm sure when people used to make matches by hand, by dipping into tubs of phosphorus and rounding off their mouth, so it's a phosphorus poisoning, and you get this terrible necrosis. And then recently we presented with this osteonecrosis, so this is as a result of biphosphates used for prostate cancer. So totally unexpected side effect, but actually, in terms of pathology, is remarkably similar. So again, there's lots of different, and I use the word stories advisedly. Medical museums, any museum, curators, we're about telling stories to interest people, teach you something. And the backstory is always very useful. Next door, if you get a chance, is my most dependable member of staff, a man called Alan Billis. He's a terminally ill man who volunteered to be mummified, and it won a Science BAFTA, and Alan's next door, and the experiment's continuing. He works weekends, he'll be here Christmas Day, he's very dependable. And it's a very interesting experiment. So that brought us into the field of archaeology, archaeological chemists, anthropology. So again, we're pushing those boundaries when we can. Technology. We have the original Hodgkin specimens next door, next to the original Bright specimen, the Addison specimen. So they are definitely the specimens. But actually, are they what we say they are? So again, this is applying new techniques to old specimens. So very carefully, I sent away on home one day and I took some blocks out the back, and we got some histology done, and we got them re-diagnosed. Now, I'm sure Hodgkin didn't have a microscope. No microscope. 3 of them are Hodgkin's disease, one's a diffuse B-cell lymphoma. Not bad. It wasn't bad, was it really? Quite good. Objects are important. So I mentioned the X-ray machine. Next door, we've got Hodgkin's thermometer. I got very excited when I heard it was his thermometer from the family. It's actually his bar thermometer, so it's not quite as exciting, but it's still Hodgkin's, so that's good enough for me. But, we're looking for prosthetics change, so it's not just specimens, new hip replacements, etc. We've got to look for these things. There's Alan. Next door, again, if you're interested in television programmes, in the middle there, you'll see these most expensive bits of rubber you've ever seen, £60,000 worth of rubber, and those for the Crown TV series. So the very first episode had the King's pneumonectomy. So those rubber bodies are next door. I'm trying to get the actor they were modelled on to stand with them. because Jared Harris is, if you get a chance to have a quick look, the resemblance is remarkable. But for £60,000, they ought to be, really. We have a natural history wing. You know, sometimes people get fed up with that human, so they want a bit of 20 minutes with an animal or something, so that's up in the middle now. During COVID, we inherited this 20th century wax model collection from a lady called Alice Gretna. They're all dermatological. And as I said, we use wax models to teach dermatology. We're going to restart it again just after Christmas. And it's very effective. We try to get engaged with external things when we can. Legally, it's difficult sometimes, but we do what we can. Often it's a question of me going to them, but sometimes to us. We have technology. If you go online on the Royal College of Pathology, you can dial into about 300 short films on classic pathology with experts in the field talking about them. So we do embrace the technology. Something we started working on with an iPad, that you point an iPad camera at the specimen, and on the screen will pop up augmented reality. One of my students suggested it, so I nodded sagely and then went off quickly, looked up what augmented reality was. So it's not easy, but it's something we want to experiment with. New techniques for old specimens. Here and there, you may have noticed the screens where it's all in 3D without any glasses, something called allioscopy. So again, that's something we're working on, so things we want to try and do. And there's that hip horoscopy, that's what you see. It works really well. I've had a go on more than one occasion. I'm not sure, Richard, if I'm ready for my first patient yet. I'm used to people being dead, I'm afraid, but I might have a go. So we've got lots to do. We've got the augmented reality, we've got the allioscopy to do. I've inherited 3.5, basically, other museums that I've got to do something with. We have a huge image collection of at least 600,000 transparencies of gross pathology in patients, 200,000 of histology, paper archives. So there's a lot to be done. So I need to live for probably another 50 plus years to try and get it done. Used to see this sign everywhere I went in Europe, and used to see it in Britain a lot, but sadly we don't anymore. But I think it applies then and it does now. The dead teach the living. I'm sure the rest of the evening will be fantastic. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you so much. Bill, thank you very, very much indeed. I'm sure you'll agree, what a wonder. And I said we'll have a little bit of time at the end to have a look around and really enjoy it. So we're going to dive straight in now to our speakers for the rest of the evening. And it gives me great pleasure to welcome up to the podium Dr. Max Skelton, who's the Policy Research Director at the American University of Iraq in Kurdistan. And this year's subject, and I think, Mac, if I'm right, I still have your presentation. Let me have a look at it. Oh, look at that. Marvellous. It actually works. All ready to go. This year's theme, obviously, is Cancer Without Borders, and for a good reason, is we have a completely new challenge ahead of us, which is how to care for cancer patients with the increasing complexity of conflict and climate-driven migration. And this year's theme, really, I think, from our perspective, was something we wanted to tackle, and I can't think of a better speaker to start us with. Mac, thank you so much.
Thanks, Richard. All right, everybody. So I'll get right to it. Oops, there we go. So I'm an anthropologist, so forgive me for having a very anthropology-forward talk here. So about how conflict has shaped this nonlinear journey of care. Today I'm going to speak about the therapeutic geographies of cancer care in the Middle East, with a focus on the geography of care for Iraqi cancer patients. The term therapeutic geographies emerged about a decade ago when doctors, social scientists, and public health professionals in the Middle East were grappling with the war-related destruction of state-run healthcare systems and the resulting reconfiguration of the routes of accessing medical care in the region. Doctors in places like Jordan, Lebanon, and Turkey were seeing just as many patients from Basra, Baghdad, and Aleppo as they were seeing locals from their own populations. And this was especially the case for complex conditions like cancer. This movement of patients across borders wasn't merely a result of displacement, but also the result of cross-border care-seeking strategies that emerged in relation to the deterioration of healthcare in Iraq and Syria. So in the context of all of this movement, it just wasn't helpful anymore conceptually to think in terms of healthcare systems that were neatly confined to the borders of states. Therapeutic geographies captured a region in which war was generating transnational routes and markets of medicine. So I've put up here just a few of the characteristics that we associate with therapeutic geographies. So we have a kind of unraveling of nation-centric healthcare systems. And so we have to have kind of, I guess you'd say, transnational frameworks for both researching and developing policy approaches to conflict and post-conflict cancer care. From the perspective of patients and indeed doctors who are caring for them, patients often experience therapeutic geographies as unpredictable and unstable, as in flux. So conflict and shifting border rules and down to very sort of kinship pressures like depreciating finances are continuously reshaping these geographies of care, so they're not static. And this also raises a number of research and data difficulties, which we will discuss as this paper goes forward. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what this looks like in Iraq, and then we can think a bit more regionally. So in Iraq, in the 70s and 80s, you had kind of the emergence of a nation-bound cancer care system that was mostly centered around three hubs: Baghdad, Mosul, and Basra. You can see in the northwest, and the southeast, and in the center. There were other centers throughout the country that could provide surgical care and sort of basic diagnostics, but anything like chemotherapy, radiotherapy had to be referred to one of these three places. Now, starting in the 1990s, after the Gulf War, this geography started to come under pressure because, especially with the Gulf War and then the sanctions that came after it, medical supply chains became quite tested. So things like Linacs would often just not be operable. And so you'd have a place like Mosul where, somebody would have chemotherapy, but as soon as they needed to have radiotherapy, they would have to go to Baghdad. But more or less, this geography kind of maintained itself. There were periods in which the provision of care in Mosul wouldn't be as good or wouldn't be as good in Basra, but more or less the kind of referral system that had defined the cancer care geography prior to 1990 stayed in place. But then after 2003, things start to get a lot more complicated. Starting right after the invasion, the pre-2003 geography of care comes under stress. So Baghdad, Mosul, and Basra are all experiencing severe and persistent conflict. Hospitals are becoming embroiled in the activity of war to the point that many families start to fear going to the hospital. They're no longer considered safe havens. It was especially difficult for families and patients that did not reside in one of the three big cities to engage in the kind of long-standing referral patterns, because travel over lengthy distances required traversing a fragmented array of political and security terrains. So the pre-war geography of care, or the pre-2003, one should almost never say pre-war geography of care in Iraq, which relied on mobility across the country, was starting to break down. But then by 2007, what we started to see was massive displacement as well as cross-border strategies of care seeking. So Iraqis start undergoing cancer treatments in Beirut, in Jordan, in Turkey, and in Iran, in addition to the displaced, which were residing in these places and receiving cancer care in residence, as it were. We also had a phenomenon where, the most stable areas of the country in the kind of post-2003 period was the Kurdistan region in the north. So Erbil and Suleimania emerged as sort of new cancer hubs. So patients that might normally or previously have gone to Mosul would start going to Erbil or Suleimania. And so therapeutic geographies aren't just a story about sort of, cross-border movement and people going to other places. It's also about the reconfiguration of care within countries, and the kind of interprovincial travel routes become rerouted. So, it's one thing to observe this geography of care in sort of broad terms, and it's quite another to grasp how patients and their doctors navigate it, and what it means for their experience of care. And as an anthropologist, the kinds of interview methodologies and research methodologies that are available to me are, mostly we value as anthropologists moving with patients and accompanying them in their journey of care. But for this kind of phenomenon, you really do need to be able to establish a broader picture of what's going on. And so we did a lot of interviews within hospitals that were kind of along the geography of care. So you could put yourself in Erbil or in Suleymaniye or in Mosul or in Beirut, interview patients and get a sense for what was happening across this geography, because the patients that you would interview would have been oftentimes to 5 to 10 places before you were interviewing them. And so you got this broader sense of the geography even though you were rooted in one place. And so you can do a lot of mapping and contextualizing treatment locations. You can also get a sense of the costs of care at each location, because financial toxicity is a major problem when it comes to these geographies of care. And then, in terms of sort of the broader illness narrative and meaning of the disease and how people experience this kind of trajectory, you can learn a lot just by sitting with patients and having them recount to you their trajectory. But that you do eventually come to some limits, and I'll get to that in a second. But this is the kind of map that you can, produce for each patient, right, that you interview in these kind of settings. Apologies, it's a very crude map, but hopefully it will at least give you an idea. This is going back to Abu Samr, who we discussed at the beginning. 2013, 2014, he starts having symptoms. He does a series of investigations in Salahuddin, so that's point 1, sort of central Iraq. Then goes to Baghdad, then goes to Kirkuk, then finally in Erbil where he is diagnosed. You might ask, so why does this unfold in this way? Well, we've already sort of established in the prior slides that Erbil has sort of emerged as this sort of post-2003 cancer hub. So a lot of the referral networks end up funneling northward, even though Baghdad was, in terms of geographical distance, much closer to him. Then, he decides actually, he doesn't necessarily just decide, he is informed that in Erbil it will take much too long for him to get chemotherapy, and so he goes to Beirut for chemotherapy and radiotherapy. And then after he does chemoradiation, ISIS, takes over about a third of the country, which forces him to be displaced from, I guess you'd say, point 1, then to point 6, does a little bit of treatment in Mosul while ISIS is controlling the hospital. Then he flees to Baghdad because conditions worsen in Mosul, does a little bit of treatment there as well, and then finally decides that the most stable place for him to be will be Erbil, and so settles in Erbil. But then you see what's interesting about, and a bit puzzling about his trajectory of care, is once he is settled in Erbil, which, by the way, is one of the strongest sort of cancer care hubs within Iraq, he keeps moving. So he keeps going. You can see, treatment as a displaced person, 2015 to 2020. He keeps going to Beirut, some to Ankara, some to Erbil, and never quite settles in one place in terms of his trajectory of care. And this is where we kind of get to the limit of a strictly interview-based methodology. In terms of trying to understand why does this happen? Why does this mobility kind of keep unfolding in this way? And in fact, with Abu Samr, who's a patient that I knew quite well, His doctor would ask me, and not just ask me, ask him and his family, because she was frustrated. Why won't Abu Samar listen to me? He keeps going back and forth. He won't settle down. We have the same medication here in Erbil as they have in Beirut. I've talked to his oncologist in Beirut. She agrees that he should, stick to Erbil. His family members also agreed with the oncologist because he'd spent about $200,000, was severely, and this was money that was raised across a huge agricultural network. There were properties that had been sold. The family was starting to get to the end of its rope. This is the kind of thing that you can really only disentangle through ethnographic research. And as an anthropologist, I guess I am biased, but I do think anthropology is useful in certain kinds of situations. So let me just give, just to finish this talk up, just a quick anecdote. So one day, Abu Samar and I were sitting on the edge of his farm. Pain was surging in his nasal cavity. He couldn't get up to take a look at his watermelons, which he liked to do. Whenever his pain surged, he became quite sure, and this was around 2016 or 17, that he was going to die soon. But he'd talk about in those moments how he needed to hang on just a bit longer. Why did he need to hang on just a bit longer? Well, his eldest son was 17 at that point, and as a displaced person living under the tutelage or under the generosity in many ways of the Kurds, but still in a kind of tenant farming relationship, so it was unstable, he wasn't sure that his son, who was unmarried at the time, would be able to cut it as a head of household. He needed to hang on for 1 or 2 more years so his son could get married and so that he could shore up his position as a head of household. Beirut, for Abu Samar, represented the site where the technologies of care were strong enough and powerful enough to make those 2 years possible. At the same time, around this time, the war in Mosul was heating up, and there were scores of Sunni Arab patients that were coming into the hospital in Erbil. Now, Abu Samar was Sunni Arab, and he had been provided chemotherapy by this Kurdish hospital really without too much incident for a couple of years. But as he started to see Sunni Arabs show up at the hospital en masse and start to be turned away because there were simply too much patients and not enough chemotherapy, and there was a kind of ethno-sectarian politics as well involved where the Kurdish patients were being provided that care, he started to worry that in fact the Sunni Arab position was quite fragile and perhaps he would be on the chopping block next. So Beirut, in a way, represented a center of advanced technology, which could push him over the edge of his displacement and kinship problems, which were revolving around his son and his position. And Beirut also represented a relatively depoliticized terrain that he could always access no matter what happened to the messy ethnopolitics of Iraq. So, just a couple closing thoughts. I think that the study of therapeutic geographies still has a long way to go. We don't really understand very well how these mobilities work and how these regions are reconfigured. For me personally, I think we need more long-term interdisciplinary studies. I also think that visual multimedia projects that contextualize shifting geographies of care within a kind of long-term frame are important because, in fact, even practitioners don't understand these. I mean, oncologists on the ground in these countries who have been there dealing with these geographies for years and even decades really struggle to get a sense of the whole because it's a constantly changing environment. And so I think that in some cases, both research and multimedia projects are necessary to bring awareness to these issues. I also think we need to think about therapeutic geographies for specific modalities of cancer care, so including palliative cancer care. There's an effort among me and some other oncologists to do a project on palliative geographies because the technologies around palliation are quite specific, and particularly radiotherapy is quite affected by conflict. And so the routes of accessing radiotherapy are important to understand. And I also think, lastly, we need to have a widening of the regional scope in MENA and beyond, as there are a number of different cancer patient populations that are quite understudied in this regard. Thanks.
Mac, thank you so much for kicking us off with an absolutely fantastic talk and unpicking so elegantly some incredible complexity and some lived experiences. We're going to change gear slightly here now, and it's a huge pleasure to welcome to stage Dr. Ajay Aggarwal, consultant clinical oncologist here at Guy's, and also associate professor at London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. And it's really to give you a sense that this isn't just about low and middle income countries. There is also therapeutic geographies of the global north as well. And hopefully your slides should be out. There they are. There we go. All yours.
Thanks, Richard. Thanks, everyone. So a bit of a different take. I mean, it's a fantastic talk, Mac. And I think one of the things you were talking about, displacement and patients moving to try and get care to stay alive. And I think in many respects in the global north it's slightly different. And then from a policy perspective, it's very much thought of that movement of trying to improve outcomes. And there's one thing in terms of trying to access care to get better outcomes, patients as consumers, but there's also what we want from a policy directive. So I want to go into the policies within many high-income countries. We're very used to the command and controls. You centralise. If you do more procedures, you're going to be better at it. That's been the sort of watchword since the 2000s of how we organise care. But we have two major policy directives, both pure competition on the basis of cost and quality, which you probably see more in the US, and more of a subtle patient choice directed competition, which you see more in the UK and other countries across Europe, but based on behavioural economics. How can we nudge providers to improve their outcomes? But both of them rely on harnessing patients as consumers. It's explicit that patients will choose care that they think is better. So we're asking patients to do that as a directive. So choice and competition policy. So this is Julian Legrand, who was one of my tutors at the London School of Economics about a decade ago. Very smart, great discussions, the sort of thing why you do a master's. And one of the things he said was actually in Tony Blair's government, they'd gone from targets, firing people because waiting lists were too long, to saying, look, we need a bit more of a subtle approach. You know, let's do this patient choice. You know, neoliberal policies, people are able to look for themselves at information, they're able to understand and contextualize, let them make the decisions as to where they have their care. But here's where the nudge comes in. We don't expect everyone to move. We only expect about 5 or 10% of people. So what was the idea was that there'd be a website and any care, your hernia, whatever treatment, you'd be able to see, okay, these are the best providers of care. I'm going to choose that one. But actually, in reality, most people prefer local care, so not many people would choose it. But it's a nudge, and people will then improve their outcome. That was the policy directive. There are a few pilots which didn't really show anything, but actually it became policy. And so it's enshrined within our law that everyone within the NHS has a choice of where they go for treatment. But there's very limited evidence, despite a policy that changes the directive or the nature of our relationship with providers, of actually whether patients select where they go for treatment. Most of all, and probably the biggest argument I had with Julian Legrand was around equity, because well, patient choice is equitable within the NHS. You know, money follows the patient. So actually, they don't have to pay anything, so anyone can choose. So that was a big thing, and I said, well, the patients I see who come out of there are slightly different from those who are choosing. But anyway, we begged to disagree, and that formed the basis for actually my PhD and the NIHR, which was to ask the question, really, do patients shop around for their cancer care? I had my own thoughts about it, but that was the hypothesis. So this was a piece of work looking at all men who had prostate cancer surgery in England. And what we could see in this map of England, you just need to see the green dots. It keeps it very simple. So the green dots are basically all the patients who had prostate cancer surgery for which their local hospital was Norwich. Everyone's like, told you so, you know, why have you bothered doing this? Why have the NIHR spent all this money on this really silly neoliberal London idea? But I had no, they didn't. That was just a dream I had once. No, anyway, but the reality was very different. And I was like, look what's happening in Bristol and Cambridge. So as you can see, so the crosses are radical prostatectomy centres. There were 65 at the time. The sea of green on the left-hand side is Bristol, and the green is the local patients. The blue dots are all the patients, despite having a prostatectomy service, who travelled to Bristol for their care. Same with Cambridge, people were coming from North London, East Midlands, but travelling 2-3 hours. And the question is, who are these patients? How many are actually doing this? Because, as I said, people thought local care, maybe a few might move in London, but this was Bristol and Cambridge. And so what we found was actually 1 in 3 men having prostate cancer surgery in the NHS were going to a centre other than their nearest one for their treatment. Younger, fitter, more affluent. Are we surprised? Probably not, but actually there was a policy which said it's likely to be equitable or it wouldn't be so much of an issue. So then the next question is, where were they going to? So you have these centres. Suddenly there's going to be an influx of patients for some centres, as we can see on the left side. So these are centres that gained more patients than they lost from their catchment area. And on the right side, centres that lost more patients than they gained. So this was happening at the same time as though there were policies around centralisation. You still, if you were a prostatectomy centre, still had to do a minimum of 50 surgeries per year. So there are these centres gaining patients. The ones that gained the patients were the ones that were early adopters of robotics. This wasn't in the guidelines. They often fundraised for robotic surgery, and they got it, and the market share moved towards them. So there should be, technically, an incentive for improving quality. But what happens to those that are losing patients? Well, we found that they closed their service because they weren't performing enough procedures because there was this centralisation policy. So without knowing it, we had a choice and competition policy which allowed patients to move. We hadn't actually mapped to whether patients moved or not. Centres weren't doing enough surgery, and then they closed. So if you're a centre in that sort of mid-range, what would you do? You're seeing patients moving or potentially moving. You're seeing, well, there's some neighbours in London and places that are gaining patients. What would you do? You'd get a robot, wouldn't you? So between 2010 and 2016, we went from only 10% of centres having robotic surgery to 90%. We also had a closure of centres from 65 centres to 52 or 53 centres. It was natural selection as we know it. And what was interesting, in 2017, the NHS England came out with a policy saying responsible adoption of robotic surgery for prostate cancer, completely oblivious to actually that this had already happened. So what you have is policies intertwining, but actually based on consumerism. So providers were trying to differentiate themselves, not through necessarily outcomes, but actually what is our recognition? We want to be a robotic centre. And so we had patients who were being referred to those centres, and this resulted in a disconnect in the policy itself. So what did we find? And I did some, not quite ethnographic, but I did some interviews. I tried my best. But what we thought was, well, cancer matters. Outcomes matter. Care is care. They want to make sure that people are being well served, and especially for something that's potentially toxic, like prostate cancer surgery. So patients were highly responsive, much more than the 5 or 10% that they envisaged. And that was looking at things more like hernias. It's information anarchy out there. The number of patients who just told me we just did not know where to look. They would be either speaking to, their peer support network, or they would be looking online. But actually, in terms of outcomes as to how they're going to do from receiving care, there was nothing there. So brand is king. Technology is king. It makes sense. One person spoke of going to their local supermarket and being allowed to sit on a Da Vinci robot in the southwest. You have that sort of marketing that's going on. We don't think of it in the UK. It's all very nicey, but it's still going on, even though we think not. So we have to recognise about these incentives. But where was the incentive to improve the outcome? Because there wasn't any actual information on the outcome itself. And actually, quite sadly, the hospitals themselves faced quite an existential threat. And speaking to one of the clinicians, he said, well, if we don't get a robotic service, we'll lose our prostate cancer surgery, we might lose our bowel cancer surgery, we might lose our... So there was a threat that comes. So actually, if there is a threat, is it possible to harness that to improve outcomes? Well, we don't know, and that's where the policy really needs to link in. But then you had all these centres that didn't have high volumes, who had a robot. So what happens? Stage migration, more high-risk prostate cancer treatment, all the other tumour types that are now being used. So it goes on and on. But what's the most important thing, really? What are the surgical outcomes now that everyone has a robot? And so this is data I'm going to show you from the National Prostate Cancer Audit. And these dots are individual centres, so there are 50 centres. And for severe urinary side effects after robotic prostatectomy, your likelihood of having a urinary toxicity goes from about 3% to 30%. And they've all got robots. So we're in a position where patients move, thinking they're having better care. It's inequitable, younger, fitter, more affluent. People have bought robots at increased cost, but there's no evidence of improved care for those, because actually to improve the quality of surgical care is 101 quality assurance of the actual techniques involved as well. I'm not saying that robotics doesn't have a role, but it's actually what are we deriving these policies for, and if we're using patients as consumers, the end result of it needs to be a more efficient and better health service as a result. So this is a piece of work that we did in rectal cancer. This was published recently in JAMA Surgery, where we were looking at rectal cancer, which is another area where there's been a lot of differentiation of practice, particularly introduction of robotics. Not all centres have them, about 12, 13 at the moment. We know that outcomes matter. We've also got information both in terms of that's reported on the quality of the hospital, so we have this Care Quality Commission rating, but we also have outcomes at the patient level that are publicly reported. We found 1 in 4 patients were moving. This is St Thomas's, so we have quite a large catchment area of people coming from outside to have their treatment here. And robotic surgery, again, was probably the biggest driver of patients moving, and also actually what our overall rating was in terms of a hospital. But people weren't sensitive to treatment-related outcome measures. So we need to investigate these questions. It's about this evidence-informed policy perspective where we're using patients as consumers, but we're not necessarily improving the outcomes. And then this was an opinion editorial in the Lancet Oncology by Calypso Chalclidu, where can we put the death knell on competition? Well, I don't think so, because we've actually never been in a position where people are going to move. People are always going to want better care if they can, and there's going to be different incentives for that. We've not even got to the stage where we have good information, where people know that they can access that information, or a system where we have different policy directives, particularly with regards to centralisation, interlinking. So we don't know at the moment, and that's the genuine truth. Have we actually created the incentive structure to drive outcomes? But in terms of what I've shown you before, we were warned. You know, there is a use for academics, and whether it's an economist, so Ken Arrow back in the 60s, talking about information asymmetry and market failure, Anne-Marie Moll, you know, where does care come into choice? You know, about building trust, working with teams, having a journey with your providers in terms of delivering that care. Pierre Bourdieu talked about rules of the game, you know, the golf course phenomenon of people finding out who the best person is or having the resource to go privately. You know, these things were all talked about for a long time. And also just the inherent beliefs or motivations potentially of clinicians, so competitive advantages for early adopters by Everett Rogers, again in the 70s. So there are some very thoughtful people who think about these elements, but we need to feed this more into our policy. I think the final slide that I'm going to show you was just around the policy and where it's going in terms of patient mobility, and around the time of the pandemic to try and post-pandemic to try and reduce the actual backlogs, there was a thought of using a website for patients to see where centres were that had lower waiting lists for various procedures. And this opinion editorial, Fiona's here as well, which we wrote for the BMJ, which effectively said that it's not a good idea. We need central coordination, and we're just going to widen the inequalities that already exist or can exist as a result of patient mobility. So that was just a different take on the therapeutic geographies, patients as consumers driving up performance. We've got a long way to go, but there is potential. Thank you.
Thank you, Ajay. I'm pleased you said there's a use for academics, not just as draft excluders. It's nice to know we can be useful for something. And I hope you're getting a sense as well here about how data can be used in different ways, whether it's qualitative or quantitative. We're extraordinarily lucky in the UK to have the national cancer audits, of which Ajay is now the clinical director, because they provide such rich quantitative data to do these sorts of investigations. We're going to now sort of widen the scope up, and we're going to head back, unfortunately, into the field of conflict now. And it's a huge pleasure to welcome Dr. Horia Vulpe to the stage. Horia is not just a clinical oncologist, I believe, practicing in Hawaii. Is that right?
In California.
California, that must be tough. We'll talk about that later. He's also the director of clinical care programs for the Blue Heron Foundation, which has been one of the most important groups helping Ukrainian refugees navigate incredible complex geographies of care during the war. But thank you very much indeed for being with us today. And I'll put your slides up, which I think are all preloaded. Where are they? Ah, there we go. There we go. Good. Over to you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks for the introduction. It's we're actually not quite at the first slide. I don't want to give the punch away. Here we are. So it's a great honor to be here in the historical space and also following these amazing high-quality talks. I'm going to talk a little bit more like a report from the field and from the front lines about Ukrainian refugees seeking cancer care in Romania and in Moldova. So I'm a radiation oncologist. I currently work in California, and I have a grant funding from ASCO, Astro, and UICC. So this is our experience helping refugees in Eastern Europe in the region of Ukraine, Romania, and Moldova. And I'm going to give you right away the conclusion. So we helped over 162 refugees access cancer treatments in the region, including 125 that got treatment, 110 in Moldova. We've evacuated 25 from Ukraine, 13 from Moldova, and 14 were already in Romania. We've paid for essentially all the cancer treatment costs in Moldova for just over a year. So we know that a lot of bombs hit a lot of healthcare, hospitals, ambulances, clinics. That's just a feature of war. So during this time, a lot of Ukrainian refugees fled with a dual purpose of fleeing the violence, but also seeking care abroad because of the disruption in the health system. And cancer is particularly sensitive to disruptions in complex health systems. But the European Union enacted a temporary protection directive on March 4th, so we know they get access to medical care in the European Union. So is that problem solved? That's when I got a call. So I partnered with an organization called the Blue Heron Foundation that had no real ties to global oncology or anything medical. They were helping students that are orphaned and abandoned in the region for 20 years in educational programs. But Stefania, she's the founder and president, Stefania Magicin, she's Romanian just like me. We both have strong ties to our countries. And Dr. Tosino, she's a full radiologist, full professor at Yale. And we decided to get on a call with some of the contacts that they had in Moldova. And early on in April, they told us, listen, we're a small country, we don't have a lot of resources, but we have the highest proportion of refugees per capita in Europe. We're not part of the European Union, so refugees don't get comprehensive cancer care. They get emergencies, HIV, vaccine treatment, that's pretty much it. And even for our own citizens, we don't have immunotherapy, targeted therapies, modern radiation, CT-guided biopsies, or bone marrow transplant, and so forth. So low resource setting. Now, yes, refugees can move on to Western Europe, European Union settings to get care, but a lot of them, they don't want to leave because of language barriers. They speak Russian in Moldova. They're comfortable there. There's a Ukrainian minority. They have cancer. They might be sick. They might be old. They don't want to finish their life in Norway on chemotherapy for 6 months. That's not really a very easy step to take for a Ukrainian patient who had just fled their country. So they had hundreds of refugees registering at the Institute of Oncology. And now we said, okay, well, in Romania, we hear that cancer treatments are covered. Our partners there tell us that there's a lot of capacity. There's been a lot of privately owned clinics that have competed with each other, American style. So now there's quite a few cancer centers with modern treatments. They have 2 gamma knife machines. They have immunotherapy, targeted therapy, and the treatments are covered, and it's very close. The problem in Romania is that the system is not made for people who don't speak Romanian or English. You can't just press on a button and get a translator. There's no navigators to help them through the system. There's still out-of-pocket fees that Ukrainian refugees can't pay. So the problem there was navigation and support, and not cancer treatment cost itself. So I decided to go to Moldova to see what the situation was on the ground. Always good to go and find the information firsthand. I was in Chisinau in May as an invited professor there. I met the team. I spent some time in Kyiv, Lviv, Chernivtsi as well to meet our colleagues there. And Stefania and Irina also went to Eastern Europe on several fact-finding missions. And what we found that in Ukraine, there's longer wait times for treatment, for tests, for diagnosis. They used to have immunotherapy through clinical trials, but when they closed after the war, then that got cut off. The radiation departments were underdeveloped already before the war, so now they had to accept all these new patients from the east. So you had cobalt machines running 24/7, surgical materials in short supply, doctors being redeployed to the front lines, and the training of specialists was all messed up as well. So you can see in this chart that the out-of-pocket costs have gone up even before the war, and after the war they went even higher. We heard earlier today from Dr. Nelia Melnichuk from Harvard that on a recent survey, more than 60% of patients had to pay additional out-of-pocket fees for anything from testing to treatment to cover their own surgical material, supplies, and so forth. So that's a very difficult thing to do, especially if you're already financially strained because your country's at war. Recent data from Tim Hanna in 2020, big meta-analysis showing that even 1 month of delay in cancer treatment can lead to about 10% of decrease in survival, so 60 to 13%. So time was of the essence. We devised a plan. We had 3 goals. 1, to bridge Moldova in their financing, so we decided just to pay for the cancer treatments of Ukrainian refugees until surely some big government or large organization would take over. 2, to relocate the patients who needed to relocate to Romania if they couldn't get treatment in Moldova or in Ukraine, and then support the ones that are already in Romania. So in Moldova, we paid for surgery, chemo, radiation. We also paid 6 coordinators, physicians, and administrative personnel there, because Moldova is not a place where you have extra HR resources to devote to an influx of refugees. So that was really instrumental to our success. We partnered with the International Organization of Migration, the UN Migration Agency. They offered to pay the pre-treatment investigation, so everything from imaging, diagnosis. Many patients came to the cancer center without a clear diagnosis, actually didn't have cancer, so they were covering all of that. And once they were diagnosed and staged, we took over and we managed each case individually and approved the patients for treatment. We coordinated very closely with the Institute of Oncology, and then when we needed to, we relocated patients across the border in Romania. It's just a short ride. Iași is a border city. Sometimes they even continue to live in Moldova. They just got their immunotherapy or their targeted therapy in Romania. In Romania, we provided everything from registration as a refugee to transport, housing, navigation, coordination, interpretation. So every appointment, we had an interpreter, mostly in person, but sometimes on the phone, to communicate with the doctors, and when we could, psychosocial support. And then we got more and more calls from within Ukraine. People wanted to leave, and the mechanisms of evacuation to Western Europe were already kind of slowing down. So we evacuated the ones we could to Romania and the ones that would benefit most. So how do we select them? Localized patients and sometimes oligometastatic patients, good performance status, and if they didn't have the treatments available in Ukraine. That triage is not natural for us, right? We treat everybody who comes through the door, so that was a difficult exercise. Patients who were in Romania already, and were in Moldova already, didn't have any other sources of support, so we just enrolled everybody, even palliative care patients. But doing an evacuation for somebody that is very poor performance status with metastatic disease was going to take too many resources, both human and material, for us. How did we evaluate patients? First, we said, oh, well, let's do multidisciplinary tumor boards, right, because we're academics. So that was a bit of a disaster. Organizing 15 doctors from across 7 different time zones to meet at a certain time, that took 2 weeks, and that was delaying the care of a population whose care has already been delayed. And ultimately, a lot of cases are straightforward, right? And then you spend some time explaining to the international experts the reality on the ground. So we only turned to them in the future when we really needed to, when we had a complicated case. For documentation, everything was put on this web platform called Medicai. This is a Romanian platform that was gifted to us. We worked very closely with them. Medical files, imaging, everything HIPAA compliant, GDPR compliant. We could move the data across borders. We created confidentiality agreements. We created patient information pamphlets, very important to manage expectations. I'm a big policy and procedure guy, so we wrote down everything, all our process, so that all our team would work really efficiently with each other from all the countries. We translated the files professionally, very important too. Volunteers are good, but they take time. And then we kept track of every patient regularly at regular meetings on just kind of Google Sheets. That was password protected. We didn't really have a better tool for that. This is our team in Romania and Moldova. Really grateful for them. They've done an extraordinary job. Especially Cristian Teglas, he's the main coordinator in Romania, and when you're having such a logistical issue, it helps to hire somebody who's a retired brigadier general in Romanian army in artillery. Logistics guys. So here's the slide again. So this is the patients we could help. Right now we're probably around 170 patients supported, maybe 130 treated, but we couldn't help everybody. So 29 patients we kind of lost track of. They retracted their request or became unreachable. There's a huge back and forth like we saw in the other talks. People go to different places to seek care, and there's a bit of a chaotic flow. So some patients just dropped off, and then 56 patients were either too sick or not well enough to travel or they had therapies available locally. I wasn't going to evacuate somebody for a Gleason 6 prostate cancer. We referred these patients to Inspiration Family and Mission Kharkiv, that are patient organizations within Ukraine, and the kids we sent to St. Jude's. Got a lot of help for transportation from Safe Passage for Ukraine, which is US vets, Be an Angel from Germany. Our team did some runs to Ukraine as well. Apartments, we rented some. We had refugee hotels, refugee centers. Some refugee centers were really nice with co-working spaces and like cinemas. Looked better than my apartment in New York. And then psychological support is really important, because think about the insane amount of stress these people are undergoing. We had a Ukrainian-speaking psychologist in the city of Cluj, and so she helped a lot of our patients. A few more slides. So speed is really of the essence, like I said. What we did is we had every single patient before relocation to Romania assessed and evaluated and approved by a local cancer specialist. So the moment they came to Romania, we knew they were there to be treated, and our mean time from the time they left Ukraine when they got to Romania was 7 days, and from Moldova to Romania was 2.5 days. As a comparison, we brought one young lady to Germany, and it took 3 months to get the health insurance. Thankfully, she didn't have cancer. Finances, we got a grant from the UICC, and we got private donations, and then we used the foundation's funds as well. We didn't get renewals of the grants. I think a lot of the granting agencies, they're like, well, this is not a short-term project. What are you doing exactly? So we went to pharma and medical technology companies. We said, help, we're holding this huge bag, this whole country's cancer treatment programs. If we stop paying, they're sending people home in the middle of radiation, and we're just a small NGO with one cancer doctor. And they said, oh, you want a grant for research and education? I said, none of my cancer refugees asked me about research or education. So, but understandably, we don't have a mechanism really to do humanitarian work in oncology. And as a company, there are also compliance issues to paying directly for people's treatments. So, and the large EU grants are not really accessible to small NGOs. They're just too complex to get. So roughly costs us about $57,000 a month at the peak. So that's like 2 or 3 infusions of pembrolizumab in the US. So we're tapering down the program in Romania. Situation has improved in Ukraine. The flux of refugee has decreased. Some of my team is staying on as volunteers. And in Moldova, we were really lucky because the UN Migration Agency, as of June 1st, offered to take over the cost of cancer treatments. So they'll be able to provide a much more stable source of income for Ukrainian refugees there. And we do have longitudinal projects now that I think is more appropriate, research, education, building their residency program, and so forth. And I usually end by saying, cancer patients in all areas of conflict need our help, and they need it right now. And these are some of our testimonials. This is what kept us going during the really difficult times. And it wouldn't be a talk about Ukraine without a picture of borscht. So thank you very much. This is all our collaborators. Thanks for your attention.
Horia, thank you so much. I thought this was a really important talk to have because of the precedence of Ukraine, but also because actually the foundation has been one of the few to actually produce some real data to share with people, because I think a lot of these operational science questions are simply lost in the midst of time. We come, unfortunately, to our final talk, and by far the hardest one to give, I'm afraid, to talk about the therapeutic geographies of cancer across continental Africa. It's an enormous pleasure. Thank you very much for being with us today to welcome Her Excellency Dr. Zainab Bagudu, who, as you all know, is a board member of the UICC, First Lady of Kebbi State, and also consultant paediatrician. Thank you so much for tackling what is a huge subject area. Please.
Thank you. First off, I'll confess I don't have slides. I will talk to you about it. We can take this down. Should I?
Down, yes.
Okay, it's better. Okay, so we want to talk about the problems that we have in Africa, and I want to put it in the context and make you understand that a lot of the things that you've heard today are probably, yes, conflict situations and the issues that come up, but for us, they can be the norm. Political crisis abounds across most of Africa. There's hardly any country that doesn't have one form or the other of an ongoing conflict. And this political crisis usually leads to armed conflicts. When you have armed conflicts, there is a disruption of the weakened already health systems that we have, particularly when it comes to cancer. Right now, the UNHCR says there are about 27 million displaced people in Africa. There are other reports that says there are up to 44 million, and even higher in some reports. A lot are not accounted for, and the aspects that we hear mostly about these people is the humanitarian crisis. When conflicts occur, we talk a lot about the humanitarian crisis in terms of hunger, in terms of food security. There's very little about the health or education of these people that are affected. And there's even less so about people that have cancer. In our region, I'd say in Kebbi or in Nigeria, we do have some areas that have insecurity where we don't have cancer services fully as it occurs in the West or the higher income countries, even in the unstable regions like Ukraine that we've just heard about. But we do deliver chemotherapy, surgery, and to some extent, radiotherapy. Access is disrupted by conflicts, and access in terms of road. In Nigeria, there was a study in 1999 that showed that 70% of the population need to travel for 4 hours continuously to access radiotherapy care. And we all know what the delays cause. We've heard a bit about it. In the BMJ in 2020, there was a research that showed that a delay of 4 weeks will lead to 10 more women dying from breast cancer. And if that delay is 12 weeks, you have 31 more women dying. So this is what happens in the conflict situations. And like I was saying, we have a lot of reporting of the humanitarian crisis. Our papers, both nationally, internationally, social media, is inundated with pictures of people, hungry children, starvation, malnourished. But we don't see the other side, or we hardly ever see things about cancer. It would be very difficult to put the picture of a fungating breast mass on a front page of a newspaper, or the smell of the cervical cancer that we see on a daily, the women that we come across, that fungating smell that is so offensive, nobody can stay in the room with her. These do not make it to the press, and these do not make it to the rooms where the issues around cancer or around the conflicts are being discussed. And like we know, there are many consequences of the armed conflicts in the already weakened health system, and cancer care is hard to access, especially in terms of the physical distance that I mentioned. 2 days ago, I listened to a very interesting webinar as part of the London Global Cancer Week. It was the oncology one, and a lot resonated. We had a group of nurses from Cameroon, the Baptiste Oncology Center or Cancer Care Center, and they spoke about the kind of hardships that they encounter. Roadblocks go up just at will of the militia, and it could last 1 day, it could last 1 week, it could last 1 year. They have no way of telling. We have similar problems. They're not really roadblocks, but they're insecure areas that makes it very difficult for even routine immunization to take place in some parts of the state and indeed across Africa. So what they have to do with the cancer patients is to wait, and there's nothing more aside from even routine services like palliative home care and community services that they would otherwise be delivering was not possible. We've heard a lot about conflicts and the restrictions, and no one yet has mentioned the issue of freedom to travel. In Abu Samir that you spoke about, one of his issues, he had a lot of traveling, and towards the end we did hear about the issues of the conflicts that occur, the political displacement and the sense of lack of platform that displaced people face. And this is very important. I have seen that personally. Like I said, in Kebbi, I don't have a slide, but I'm going to draw a map so that it puts it in perspective a little bit for you. Kebbi State is in the northwest of Nigeria. Nobody should laugh at my drawing. I'm not the best. Something like that, right? Nigeria. Not bad. So Kebbi State is in the northwest here, and it's a unique state in that it borders Niger Republic in the north. Then you have the Republic of Benin, that's Cotonou, in the southwest. And there are 3 states that it also borders. So there's Sokoto, there's Zamfara, yes, and Niger State. Sokoto, Zamfara, so these 3 states are very unstable and have a lot of insecurity with banditry and the Fulani herdsmen going on. The point I'm trying to make is, and then now you have Niger Republic and the Republic of Benin, which is not so bad. We get a lot of displaced people into Kebbi. The Boko Haram in Nigeria happens over here. Here you have Boko Haram in the northeast. Traditionally, it's a bit of history here now. Kebbi has the Argungu fishing lake and so on. There's a lot of fishing that goes on in Kebbi, but it's regulated. So in the past, there was a lot of migration, voluntary migration, because regulated fishing here, they migrated up to the northeast where it's not as regulated. So, but they have their relatives and they maintain ties. It was voluntary. But when the issues of Boko Haram started, they started coming back to their relatives in the state. So the state has a very high number, aside from the northeast. Outside the northeast of Nigeria, we have the highest number of displaced people returning voluntarily to their relatives. So what I see, and the point I'm trying to make, is that displaced people are displaced, whether it's nationally, whether it's globally, or whether it's within their own state. They don't have that sense of belonging. They don't have a platform for them to access for care. And it's worse with cancer. They don't have insurance. And when you look at it across national boundaries, they're stateless, and they do not have that ability to access any care that they need. Simple things like distribution of grains, when we do them in the state, becomes an issue, because they will tell you, the refugees themselves, the IDPs within the camps will tell you that no, they are not from here, they're not part of us. These ones are the ones that are part of us. They are not refugees. So there is that separation and politicization of even the aid that you're giving. And that issue of statelessness is one that we must address for us to be able to. There are about 10 million people that are classified as stateless in the world now. How do they get access? They can't even have consular services. How will they travel to Ukraine? You didn't have that problem because they were classified and they had a state, and they could, go to other places of the world to access better care for themselves. So what happens to those ones that don't have a state? How are we going to treat them? And this statelessness is not, I'm not talking about just Palestine and all these other places. Even within a small state like Kebbi, the displaced people have issues of a sense of belonging and what to do with their, how to go about their seeking for care. So conflict-induced migration induces a logistical challenge as well as a mental health one, which is an additional burden for cancer care. And for us to really solve the issues, I have 4 last things to talk about. These are what my thoughts are around how to improve the situation. we need to redefine humanitarian services as well as humanitarian language to include cancer. Not just the, feeble way in which it's mentioned, especially when you look at the international NGOs and the United Nations system. It's a struggle. We had a recent, that everybody knew about the recent universal health coverage meeting, the big UN high-level meeting in Geneva during UNGA and everything. But cancer was hardly mentioned in that document, hardly. People say that there is no political benefits to cancer, but having been the spouse of a governor, I know that there is. We have an indigent cancer fund, which, by the way, started out as being an indigenous patients cancer fund, but we had to change it to indigents to make other people benefit from it. So that cancer, that type of, the cancer fund was very successful, extremely successful. But if you haven't tried it, how do we know that there is no political advantage to it? Part of it is, the part of that blame lies with all of us in this room. We design our national cancer control plans for organized care by a functional government, and functioning, or should I say, by definition, and it's within a national boundary. And there's no thought given to conflict situations when our national cancer control plans are being designed. So how we need to start including those type of situations, there's been a lot said about that, and I hope that moving forward, all the plans that are going to come out will include at least one chapter. We have to keep on talking about it so that we know that the world as it exists today there are many unstable areas, and we can't just talk about how much food and water we're going to drop for them. We have to talk about more complex illnesses that even at the best of times are difficult to access care for, like cancer. Of course, I've mentioned the issue about more attention to the mental health, not just for the patients and this kind of feelings of displacements that comes with it, with the burdens that they're facing. And you do see a lot of patients that it's not the cancer that kills them, it's the issues around their refugee status and their displacement. So mental health for the patients as well as the caregivers, and particularly the healthcare professionals. Nurses undergo a lot of constraints. There's a big workforce lack. Nurses, oncologists, there's nothing, we have 100 oncologists in Nigeria. 80 I learned last week in aortic. It used to be about 120, but even more have left for the higher income countries. So there is workforce challenges, and we have to address that and look at how we can build capacity and keep them within the country. At the end of the day, a lot of this comes down to the financial benefits that they will gain from being here or being there. But there are much wider issues that we must look at around the conflict area. Peaceful dialogue, by all means, and like I said, when we have these dialogues, we have to advocate to include cancer language in all those documents that come out. Capacity building, is there a future for technology? Is there a future to have the robots, AJ's robots in Kebbi, maybe to do some, and they could be a bit more immune to the issues of war and conflict and instability. So yes, by all means, we'll be happy to have a go. I mentioned the issue of immunization and how do we get the vaccines across? I saw that a state in Nigeria that's also unstable, Kaduna State, is in the northwest as well, has had drones to deliver their vaccines. In Kebbi, what we did was to work with there's a program by the Bill Gates Foundation that supports the immunization process just for polio. And they support the military to go into the hard-to-reach, unstable areas in the southern part that borders Niger State, and they give cover It's not the best way. The drones are probably easier, but the military also have cover. So yes, improved security, improved technology with either drones or using robots can definitely help us better. So logistic challenges, but at the end of the day, peace is best. More dialogue, more peace. Thank you very much.
Your Excellency, thank you so much. And for those loving PowerPoint, please take note. Okay, this and that still works, okay, and works beautifully. So pleased to have seen that. We come to that moment now where we're going to have a little Q&A with also a panel up here, and I'd be delighted to invite Lisa Stevens and Professor C.S. Pramesh up to the stage. Very well known, both of them, of course, from IEA and Pramesh from National Cancer Grid of India and Tata Memorial Centre. And then we're also going to open it up actually for questions to our distinguished speakers. But I just want to kick off really, I'm going to pose this challenge. What you've just heard, you've both got huge experience, globally and nationally. Are our national cancer control planning approaches just not fit for purpose anymore? Do we have a problem here about adapting NCCPs with all the reality of patient movements across borders, IDPs, movements within states? What are your thoughts? Lisa?
Sure. First of all, thank you for those talks. They were quite amazing. I was taking notes. I think I can address that question a little bit easier than trying to wrap everything up. But I mean, I really appreciated what Zainab just said about the plans not including this idea of conflict. I mean, I think if you scale back even beyond conflict, how are people able to access treatment outside of their national borders? When we do these comprehensive assessments of the cancer care system in a country, the impact reviews, one of the things I want to explore is what are treatment pathways? So there may not be access to a particular treatment or even a particular diagnosis within a country, but what's the patient journey? And how can we include that within a plan while a country works to build that capacity that Zainab just talked about, acquire the equipment, build the cancer hospital? And I don't think that the plans are addressing that patient journey in a way that is helping when there's lack of access.
Excellent. Pramesh, a lot of experience intra-India and across the borders.
So I'd agree completely with what Lisa mentioned and what Zainab brought on as well, that it's one thing to have a national cancer control plan, and I think there's been quite a bit of progress made globally on more countries having national cancer control plans, them being a lot more systematically thought through before they are actually implemented. But I think there's a big gap between the actual plan and its implementation. Yep. Many countries have extremely robust, well thought through plans, but when it comes to the implementation, there's this really big gap. And what Zainab mentioned about not being prepared for pandemics or conflicts or building resilience into the healthcare system is not something that we've thought through very well in most of these plans, and I think that's something that we should certainly work on.
Questions to people? Please.
I guess it's a question for many of the speakers. Obviously, I understand the logistics and the difficulties in an area of conflict, but so I was wondering what people's experiences were or thoughts around when you think then about pediatric oncology, because surely the logistics become even harder because the child can't travel on their own and the parents have to go along, and then that might leave other children. So yeah, I was just wondering what the experience was, and then surely there is more complexity around it.
Yes, I mean, Senator, do you want to comment first?
Yeah, one of the things that I was going to mention that I didn't say is that the pediatricians were very good at making a case for pediatric patients, and it's treated as a disparity, and I think that cancer also should be highlighted as a disparity or an inequity when we're talking about the humanitarian crisis and the health situations. So that's one thing. For pediatric patients in Africa, generally the outcomes are really very poor, I'm sure you know. it's in the region of 25%. For even the ones that we have in the higher income countries, it's in the region of 90-95% AMLs and so on. So what more can we do than to keep on advocating and ensuring that they're included in access programs, which we're seeing a bit more of. But for us, it's more of the physician capacity and physician inability or not having a high enough diagnostic acumen to diagnose it on time. A lot of fevers are treated as malaria first and malaria next and malaria next before we get to the other more complex situations. So increasing capacity, which I know that organizations like SIOP have been very good work in across the continent.
Horia, I mean, so you mentioned Safer Ukraine, obviously the power and the coordination of St. Jude's. They've obviously cut their teeth in Ukraine, they're doing this now in Gaza with extracting children with cancers. Do you want to say a little bit about that?
Yeah, thanks for that question. Actually, I was going to tie that into what Her Excellency said about stageless people. We had these two kids with both of them in the same family that had hematological malignancy 6 and 10, and the mom was from Ukraine, from Crimea, but the dad was from Transnistria. If you know, that's the strip of land that is not recognized. So they had Transnistrian passports, which nobody recognized, so they're essentially stateless. And it was going to take 1 year for the Ukrainian embassy to make them Ukrainian papers. So when we sent our case to St. Jude's, they said, well, they don't have Ukrainian papers, they won't get medical insurance, even if we bring them to Europe. So we didn't know what to do with them. And eventually, working with another organization in New York, the Grace Foundation, we found a program pro bono, sponsored by the Vatican in Italy. So finally, after 3 months of discussing and negotiations, we were able to bring the kids there for their bone marrow transplant. And I don't think that answers any question. It poses the question, like, which kids really deserve our help, right? And these mechanisms of giving suddenly, all Ukrainians access to Western European care creates these inequalities in the region. That's just the fact of war, unfortunately. But more can be done, I'm sure.
Thank you, Horia. Are there other questions from the floor? I guess I just want to touch on, as we're sort of coming towards the end, this issue of displacement, internal displacement as well, and long-term internal displacement. Again, this problem of actually cancer control planning within countries that have substantially displaced populations, often individual states, almost operating like separate countries. How are we going to deal with, address those within cancer control planning? Pramish, what's your thoughts on this?
So I think we've got some experience with that with the Indian Cancer Network, and that was one of the reasons we created that. When we looked at close to 75,000 patients who visited us at the Tata Memorial, we realized that the majority of patients traveled thousands of kilometers to access even basic cancer care. And India is more a continent than a country. If you had to go through states, it would be just like going through countries in Europe. And again, the variation in the quality of care that was available in many of these states was responsible for this large-scale migration of patients. And again, pediatrics is a great example of the challenges that we face. So sometime in the early 2000s, we looked at the number of children who weren't able to complete their treatment for various reasons. And at Tata Memorial, where we put in a lot of effort to make sure that the treatment is completed, we try and subsidize the cost of treatment. 28% of children didn't complete the treatment. So in a disease where you have close to 85% overall survival in the high-income countries, if you've already lost 28% of patients not completing the treatment, I think you've lost the battle before it's started. So what we did was to institute a series of measures, and it's not one solution for everything. It's tailoring the solutions to, so offering the parents jobs at the hospital, making sure that the children's education didn't stop during their treatment, providing them with nutritional supplements, providing them with a safe place to stay, food that they were used to, as opposed to, so it was a series of these measures which actually helped. And from 28% in 2006 or 2007, we brought it down to 4%.
But again, we were able to do this only because it's a small cohort of children who had cancer. But to try and scale this up to the majority of patients with, who form the bulk of our cancer load, it's certainly something that is a challenge to scale up.
Can I answer a different question? Because I can't. No, because I want to reflect on some of the talks, and I think it's not necessarily about the plans and the displaced people, but it's looking as a community, and I'm amazed by some of the work done by single organizations, and my vision is a roundtable of interested partners looking for solutions that work with a country that has conflict, has displaced people, needs to upskill or upgrade equipment to look at how to solve these issues. And just going back to Mac's talk at the very beginning, I mean, several of the countries that he mentioned have recently had a broad assessment of their cancer care capacity, this impact review. So I think there are opportunities as the governments take on board some of these recommendations. And I'd like to see some of the sessions during London Global Cancer Week almost have a call to action. What can we do collectively? Maybe not. It's not in all countries, but maybe it's within a few places where we can bring that coalition of the willing together.
Mac, coalition of the willing, dreadful phrase in our neck of the woods, but thoughts on that in terms of what? I guess what I'm trying to understand here is this insight, this ethnographic insight. How does this feed into policy from your perspective? What would you like to see changed?
Two thoughts come to mind, and I think this is often where you see just a gap between research that's done and policy. There were a number of papers that came out that showed that the kind of Iraq-Lebanon corridor was financially toxic, all sorts of problems, and a lot of the oncologists in Lebanon were quite concerned, and they were on these papers. But then you just see that these papers would get published, problems identified. But the hospitals, it's very complicated actually to do policy implementation. So one of the ideas was we would set up this kind of Iraq-Lebanon sort of consultation, coordination. We would do financial counseling, and we would do sort of treatment planning that would involve both sides. And I gotta say, those efforts really did steam out pretty quickly. The other bit that I would say is at the more sort of national level, you often see in kind of post-conflict reconstruction just a total negation of the reality. So, what's the reality in Iraq? Thousands and thousands of people going to places like Sullivan and Erbil and to Baghdad for radiotherapy. Why would you try and, put a radiotherapy machine in a place like Tikrit, which no one will ever trust and it will never even work, much less, people even wanting to go there. It's too politically unstable. They've never gone to Tikrit for healthcare at any time. But there's a kind of subnational politics that comes up. Every province needs to have their machine. And maybe that's a nice long-term vision, but you have to formulate policy that acknowledges that these conflict produce routes of care.
Wonderful. I'm afraid we've reached the end of time. I'm sure we could chat about this for a lot longer. It's been an amazing discussion. Thank you all very, very much indeed for joining us today. Thank you, eCancer, for live streaming, to everyone who's joining us. Particularly grateful to Her Excellency. I know he's on the way to China, but thank you very much for stopping over to see us and sharing your insights. Thank you very much to Pramesh, to Lisa, to Horia, to Mac, to Ajay, and most of all, thank you all very much. And I'm pleased to say I'm going to share a few libations after this, if you care to join us. But thank you for joining us today, and really enjoyed it. Please show your appreciation to the speakers.